Message from outer space to the viewers of this video. Please enjoy our coverage of the 2022 Exeter UFO Festival. The views expressed in this program are those of the speakers. They do not reflect the views of Exeter TV, the Town of Exeter, or the Select Board. To learn more about the festival, visit exeterufofestival.org. Start video countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off.
Jennifer Stein is fascinated by anomalous phenomena and has been paying attention to it her whole life. She says her life has been a personal study of ESP, precognition, and intuition, which has guided some of her most profound life choices, like when to pay attention to premonitions to avoid major accidents or serious life-threatening situations for herself and loved ones. A UFO sighting and experience in 1975 set the course for open-mindedness early in her life, as well as a healing from an appendicitis at age 11. Jennifer was drawn to study ancient stone and effigy sites like Stonehenge, Newgrange, Serpent Mound here in America, and many other ancient stone sites at an early age. As a result, she discovered crop circles in the United States, Canada, and the UK, resulting in publishing articles and an assortment of periodicals. Jennifer has appeared on Canadian and American television programs discussing this research and traveled to many ancient sites around the world with some of the world's top researchers. She has been to Egypt with author John Anthony West, to the Göbekli Temple in Turkey with geologist and author Dr. Robert Schoch. In 2004 and 12, she visited many South American sites in the footsteps of Zecharia Sitchin, looking for clues to humanity's lost history. Jennifer has led small research groups on trips into crop circles. I was on one of them, and it was unforgettable. And archaeological museums around the world, as well as to ancient sites. Jennifer Stein is an accomplished seamstress, artist, entrepreneur, activist, organic gardener, Ashtanga yoga practitioner and teacher, a meditator, a researcher, a 20-year MUFON state section director for Pennsylvania, and now for Arizona as well. She is a former professional events coordinator with her own business, twice serving as the chairwoman for MUFON's National Symposiums in Philadelphia. Additionally, she is an award-winning self-taught documentary filmmaker who has won 4 EB Film Awards, literally the equivalent of the Academy Award in this area of endeavor, at Open Minds International UFO Congress Film Festivals. She is best known for one of her documentaries, Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton, which has won 28 mainstream film festival awards, an uncommon accomplishment for a documentary about a UFO event. She is the founder of Mainline MUFON, a free public monthly education lecture series for the Mutual UFO Network in the Wayne area of Pennsylvania. And she is the host of the public access television network program called Mainline MUFON, which has amassed 10 years of interviews with guest speakers on their YouTube channel. She has 2 brilliant daughters who live in the Pennsylvania area, and her talk is titled Description of UFO 101, a brief history review. And let me end by saying she is one of my dearest colleagues, most esteemed friends, and I am so proud to be introducing her to you today. Please give a warm welcome.
Late, and I have just a lot to get through for you. Hopefully you can hear me okay. This talk after December 17th, 2017, I lived in the Philadelphia area, and a lot of the local groups, like the local Kiwanis Club and the Lions Club and the Women's Auxiliary Club, certainly called the MUFON state section director and said, wow, it's out of the box, UFOs are here to stay, could you come and talk about it for us? I was also promoting the National Symposium for MUFON the following spring in July of 2018. So I put this talk together as a basic overall talk about certain things that you could say, discuss at the Thanksgiving table, right, with the people who were saying UFOs don't exist. So I've kind of divided this talk up into different sections. First, we're going to look at 4000 BC and Sumerian history. Then we're going to jump into what I call some alien artifacts that have been found, also from that period of time. Then we're going to look briefly at some biblical history. We're going to look at some Renaissance paintings. We'll look at some early 19th century and 20th century newspaper articles, and then we're going to jump right into 1952 and then right up into the current age. So this is like a fast whirlwind trip through UFO history. So first we're going to start back in 4000 BCE, and this is Zecharia Sitchin. He's a writer whom I gained a lot of respect for. He was a Syriologist in that he studied Sumerian text, and he was born in Russia, grew up in Israel, had his first career as a newspaper reporter, and then got into writing books. What he discovered is that Sumerian cylinder seal history and Sumerian writing history talked about an ancient world, just like the Bible does. And he made popular many new concepts that we were not aware of. One of them was this cylinder seal, which he's standing here holding a copy of, and on it is a solar system. And this solar system matches our solar system today, except it has one more planet. And the planet is in the position of where our asteroid belt is. And there is clear Sumerian history that talks about a cataclysmic event where that planet was destroyed. So it's interesting just to know that the Sumerians actually had, in their own history, a 50-year prediction of eclipses that were about to happen, both solar and lunar eclipses, and a 50-year predictive record was found of comets. And this was before they occurred in Sumerian history, and these were found in the library of Nivia in what is current-day Iraq. Many of the excavations that were done in the city of Ur and in what is current-day Iraq and Syria today uncovered wall stelas much like this. And it's interesting to denote the depictions that were on these wall stelas. You can see there were men that had wings and bird heads. We were discussing this the other day with one of the other speakers. So it's just fascinating to realize that these beings were depicted as the gods or the founders of civilization, or the founders that reestablished civilization, apparently. So Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilization was supposedly restarted around 4000 to 3000 BCE. And I've always find this interesting because the bird-headed figure is also mentioned in the Ezekiel Wheels story, which we will talk about shortly. So the area where these were discovered is what we now know as the Fertile Crescent, the top of the Fertile Crescent, which is Lower Syria, the beginning of where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers meet, and it is what is also known as the area where Garden of Eden supposedly was. So it is south-central Turkey, northern Syria, and northern Iraq. Here are more wall stela images that appear, and you can see these yourself if you go to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, or you go to the Louvre, or you go in France, or you go to the British Museum, or the Pergamon Museum. They have the largest collection of these wall stelas, which were brought back by archaeologists in the 1920s, 30s. most of these, unfortunately, have been destroyed by the Taliban, which is really quite sad. I'm standing in front of some horse figures that have hoofs on them that make them look more like steer or cattle. They have wings on the side of them, and they have human heads. Many carvings like this were at the beginning of the gates to cities in the old world, and these, of course, have been destroyed. It is unfortunately heartbreaking. Jump ahead here. On the bottom right, you can see many of these carvings if you go to many museums. This is also like a wall stela. These exist large and also small on what we call cylinder seals. These here are examples of cylinder seals. Many of these are only about 1 inch tall or less. And what is really interesting is that these are carved in reverse. So it's very complex when you roll them out into wet clay. They create these images that you're seeing in the bottom, but they are very, very teeny. So you have to kind of almost blow them up, with photographic equipment to see the complexity of them. Here is an example of this carving done in reverse. And these were done 3000, 4000 BCE. Many of these were used as icons for particular individuals. So if you were, I'll say, in today's world, you were an attorney, or you were a lawyer, or you were a police officer, or a fireman, or you were a chief agricultural person, you had a seal which designated your role. And these seals supposedly belonged to high-level people that were referred to as gods or priests, and they had specific roles. So it's I think, really quite fascinating. This is 5. So on the bottom right, you can see many carvings of this flying man, and he's in a circle here. You can see him here. Similar to what we saw before, you can see it here. I wanted to point out that this is an icon or a precursor that they used in Egypt. All they did is they took out the man in the middle. As one religion often replaces a former religion, the Egyptians still used the winged disc icon, but they just took the man out of it. This man here, according to Sumerian history, is Lord Shamash, and he is sort of removed from Egyptian history, but you still see the winged disc today. I actually use the winged disc as a business icon because my maiden name happens to be Wing, W-I-N-G-E, and I thought it was very appropriate. And again, you can see how absolutely tiny these cylinder seals are when you go into a museum. Jumping ahead, here are more artifacts that are found around in the area of Syria and also in Israel. These date back to both 4000 and 3000 BCE. These are lizard-headed figurines found in the city of what is now today southern Iraq. They're made out of clay. They're from the 5th millennium BCE. They are about 5.5 inches tall, and these happen to be female. Here are more figurines with a lizard-type woman, actually, over here on the left. On your right. This one is a nursing baby. Or this one is nursing a baby. And the strange astronaut figure over here is a very small metal sculpture that was found in Kiev in the Ukraine, and it dates back to 4000 BCE. Here are some other additional lizard-type figurines that are seen. They have large eyes, also nursing a baby. This one is from Iraq. It dates to 4000 BCE, and it currently resides in the Istanbul Museum. I have seen it. Down here on the lower right is a figure of a headless figure, actually, of an astronaut sitting in a small space capsule. This was found in 1973 in the town of Tuşba, which is today called Toprakal. It's in modern Turkey near the border with Iran. It's about 5.5 inches long, 3.5 inches high, and about 3.5 inches wide. Interestingly, although you can't see it in this picture, it has 4 exhaust engines right out of the back of it, much like the Gemini capsules did. and it has an astronaut sitting in what appears to be a capsule. This artifact, when it was brought to the attention of the museum owners by Zechariah Sitchin, suddenly went into hiding, and it is no longer available. But its historical lineage is that it came from a temple called Chaldee, and Chaldee, from the Urantia culture that was there, was considered to be a god or a top figure. There are also similar artifacts in Mexico with similar astronauts shown. I just find that very interesting. Jumping ahead. The very famous and well-known story from the Bible is known as the story of Ezekiel's wheel. So this comes from Ezekiel chapter 10, verse 9. And I'll quote from the Bible for you. A young 13-year-old boy standing alongside the Khyber River, which is located today in present-day Iraq, he witnesses the heavens open up and visions of God appear. This is the written description. He sees an immense cloud with flashing lights surrounded by brilliant light. The center looked like a glowing fire that seemed alive, with 4 living creatures in it. These living creatures appeared in human form, but they had 4 faces. One of the faces, and each being had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, but they were like that of a calf. They had human hands. Further descriptions include that each of the 4 sides of the faces were different. One side was a human, one side was a lion, the other side was an ox, and the other was that of an eagle. And a voice spoke to him with this message. I won't go and read the message, but it's quite interesting when you look at the biblical history of Ezekiel's wheel. Next, we're going to jump right into some Renaissance paintings. This is called the Madonna with Child. And I bring these to your attention because there had to be some reason why the Renaissance painters painted these images. I can't tell you why, but I leave that to you to make your own decisions. This one is called the Madonna and Child with infant St. John. It is painted by Domenica Ghirlando, and it's located in the Plaza Vecchio Museum in Florence, Italy. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is seen here looking down, and in the background there's something very unusual going on in the sky, as you can see. There is this craft. Here is a blow-up of this craft, and actually right here is this guy standing here with his dog, who are both looking up at this object. Even the dog is notating the object in the sky. This painting is from 1468. It is called The Annunciation with St. Amidus. It's by Carlo Crivelli, and it resides in the National Gallery in London. It shows a circular object shooting a thin beam of light down on the Virgin Mary. It's a golden beam that descends from a ringed cloud bank in the sky right through an opening. We have some competition, right through an opening in Mary's bedroom wall, and the destination is her head. So it sort of denotes there's something going on with possibly ESP or some kind of precognition. The image on the left over here is a close-up of what this looks like, because you can't see it from the back of the room. This is a large blue mural which is found on the walls of the Visoki Dekanti Monastery in Kosovo, Serbia. It was painted around 1350, and it's known as the Crucifixion. The artist is unknown. 2 old-looking, or odd-looking objects, I should say, maybe possibly pilots in craft, are seen in the sky on either side of Jesus. And I'll just denote them to you. And this one seems to be looking back, and this one is looking forward. So they're both looking at the scene of Jesus. This is kind of interesting. This one is an 18th century oil painting by a Dutch master named Ert de Gelder, and it depicts the baptism of Christ. And it's being aided by bright streams of light emanating from a UFO that hovers above the sky right in the middle of the scene. It was completed in 1710, and it's located in the Fitzwilliam Antiquities Museum, part of the University of Cambridge in England. You can see emanating from the object are 4 beams of light which stream down on the center of this water hole and fall directly upon Jesus and John the Baptist. This is a Dutch painting from the 15th century. The artist is also unknown, but it depicts 2 ships at sea encountering a light phenomenon, and between them it appears. And you'll notice, if you can see from the back of the room, the center painting, or the center object here, has faces in it. You probably can't see that from the back, but what is that denoting? Some sort of contact or some sort of communication? I will let you decide. This is a 15th century painting, and it depicts actually a group of people at Windsor Castle, and this is actually based on a true story. It's written about by a man named Thomas Sandby in 1783. It's described as a pale blue orb or object that appears in the evening when a group has gone out to smoke after dinner on a veranda, and they're watching this in the night sky. It treks across the sky, then stops, then maneuvers around a bit, stays stationary, and then departs very, very fast. Hans Glaser created this woodcut to depict a very famous UFO battle, which many of you have probably heard about, over Nuremberg, Germany. The date of this battle was April 14th, 1561. So many people in the village witnessed what they called a massive battle in the sky. They said there were large, dark missiles in the sky, there were globes in the sky, there were cylinder spaceships, and what they thought was, or what appeared to be, the sun. So I imagine that was like a glowing orb that appeared. And this woodblock accompanied a news article that was written about this event, and the article was described several smaller objects that emerged from a larger object and moved around the sky very erratically. After the battle, a large black triangle appeared. This event was later recorded on this woodcut. And this story was probably made most famous by Carl Jung, who wrote about this in his book entitled Flying Saucers, A Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. This painting is called The Miracle of Snow and was done by Marcellino de Penicle from 1430, and it's located in the Church of Santa Monica Maggiorio in Florence, Italy. It's actually a wall fresco. It's not like a painting you can move around, and the wall was taken and put in the museum. And I have a couple of different visuals for you because it's very interesting when you look this up and you research it. Often you only see this painting. But if you look closely, I couldn't put the whole painting here and this here for you as well, so I kind of backed up and captured this, but this and this are the same painting. And this just shows you about this much of the painting. But if you see the whole painting, you can see there's Mary and Jesus in the cloud above this scene. And apparently these people are outside looking at the snow, but the sky is full of UFO craft. And the religious connotation is this is Mary and Jesus. This is a very interesting, famous Japanese text and painting with scrolls, and it depicts an event known as Utsuro-bun. A craft apparently was washed upon the shore in 1803 on the eastern coast of Japan. The term Utsuro-bune, or bun, means empty boat in Japanese, and this is an account of a craft that appears in 5 different historical references. According to this legend, a beautiful woman who's about 18 years old, she's about 4.5 feet tall, with long red hair and a white elongated limbs, appears in this craft off the shore. Her clothing was described as being made of some beautiful, smooth, shiny fabrics. One story depicts that her craft drifts up to the beach on February 22nd, 1803, that she couldn't speak the local language, and that she was carrying a golden box. Other versions of the story claim that a fisherman actually towed her to shore, tried to communicate with her, tried to save her or rescue her. When he couldn't communicate with her, he became nervous that who was he with this beautiful young woman who was found in this craft, and he dragged her back out to sea and left her there, which sounds strange, but the craft was described as being about 17 feet high. It had crystal windows in it. The bottom was very sturdy and would resist rocks. It's just a very interesting record, and it was depicted by local artists in multiple times. Here are early airships that were reported in the San Francisco Chronicles called The Call. According to the writer Jerome Clark, numerous airship sightings like this were reported in 1896 and 1897. And I include these in the presentation because I suspect that these are clearly denoting what people saw. People know what they see and they draw what they see. And these are very different than some of the earlier paintings I was showing you from the Renaissance period. So these craft apparently appeared all over the United States around this period of time, and there were many reports of them. What's important to note is that they're representations of what look like early dirigibles. You might look at this and say, well, this looks like an early prototype to the Hindenburg, and I suspect that it was. Here are more drawings from various newspapers from all over. And what's also, to my suspicion, I think what most likely happened is these articles stopped, these drawings stopped around 1897. So it may have been a very early experiment, and the craft probably crashed and burned, and no one saw it again in the skies. Foo Fighters in the Second World War are openly reported that both, and this was both German and British airmen, reported Foo Fighters. And what were these? These were like orbs of light that flew with their craft or with their airplanes, sometimes right off their wingtips. And no one really ever figured out what they were, and it was a mystery of the Second World War. Now, this is just another rare story you probably don't know anything about, but it is historically noted, and you can go back and research it. It's known as the Cape Girardeau incident, and it happened in Missouri, April 12th, 1941. So this is many years before Roswell. A local sheriff called a Baptist minister named Reverend William Huffman to come to a scene of a plane crash and give last rites to passengers that were about to pass away. So the sheriff sent a car, picked up the minister, or the reverend, got him back to the scene, and just about the time they got out of their car, which was about 18 miles out of the town of Cape Girardeau, the reverend could see that it was a crash saucer and that it was not an airplane. Local police and firemen were already on the scene. A fire had been put out in the cornfield. Part of the side of this craft had been ripped off, and there were two alien bodies that were either dead or possibly still alive that were visible to the reverend. And as he began to figure out and get his composure, he also saw strange hieroglyphics and bizarre knobs and dials in the craft. And just about that time, the Army Corps of Engineers showed up from the Sykeston airfield, cordoned off the area, began threatening orders to everyone who was there, forced the police and the fire department to leave, and required everyone to swear on the pain of death secrecy about this event. And on his deathbed, he told his wife. And she promptly told their daughter on her deathbed. Her name is Charlotte Mann, and Charlotte began to speak about this event openly in 1970, and she had actually journal records from her father at the time, and she knew it was true because other things were recorded around the same time as that in her father's journal. On June 24th, many of you know this story, but I'll just briefly go through it in case there's anybody in the audience who doesn't know about this. Kenneth Arnold, who was an aviator, and he was an engineer, an aircraft engineer, and he was on a search and rescue mission near Mount Rainier, looking for actually a crashed small plane. He was flying over the Cascade Mountains when he saw 9 blue glowing discs, shaped objects that were traveling at an estimated 17,000 miles miles per hour in a V-shaped formation. He describes the discs looking like saucers, or two saucers, teacup saucers together, hence the term flying saucers was coined from Kenneth Arnold's descriptions. He said the saucers skipped across the sky and with stone-like maneuvers as if you were throwing a stone across the water. This sighting was actually confirmed by a prospector who was out doing some measuring with his camera equipment. It was also confirmed by a woman who was hanging laundry in her backyard and saw the same thing. And of course, we'll briefly touch on the Roswell event, which happened in July of 1947. A rancher named Mac Brazold, who was a foreman working on the J.B. Foster Ranch, found a huge amount of debris on their farm near Roswell. It was about an hour outside of Roswell, New Mexico. The area of debris was a quarter of a mile long. It was metallic debris in a cow pasture. He called the Roswell police, and the sheriff promptly turned around and called the Roswell Army Air Base, and they came out to inspect the debris. Major Jesse Marcel was one of the first people who was on the scene, accompanied by Colonel Sheridan Cavett and Master Sergeant Bill Rickett. And they were all from the military base, and they were sent to, look at the debris and, see what it was. They were very impressed by the enormity and the complexity of the debris, and they filled a car full of it and then went back to the Army Airfield base. This is one of the first times when it was described that Jesse Marcel saw and touched and felt what's known as memory metal. You could take a piece of metal, crinkle it up in your hands. When you let go of it, it re-unfolded itself and became, unwrinkled on its own. What is not known widely is that the Army was also experimenting with a unique type of radar at this time, and many people, including Stanton Friedman, who I also spoke here, he believed that possibly this increased change in radar that the military was experimenting with may have caused some ships to crash, because it's the first time they ever turned up the volume really high on their radar and then turned it back down. I would also mention that the 509th Bomb Squad, of course, was the bomb squad that dropped the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And after this event, because the airfield got so much attention, they moved that whole air base to Pease Air Force Base. And when they did, apparently the UFOs followed them. So this is very pertinent to be talking about right here. So on July 8th, of course, this is the newspaper headline. Most of you should be familiar with this by this point. And it stands for the Roswell Army Airfield captures a flying saucer on the ranch outside of Roswell. So July 9th, this debris was finally flown, once it was collected by the Army, back to the Fort Worth Airfield in Texas, and Jesse Marcel accompanied this debris. And it was there that he met Colonel William Blanchard. And there he was asked, he asked Jesse Marcel to pose with some of the debris from the what was known as a destroyed weather balloon. Jesse Marcel knew clearly he was being set up at this point, because that's not the debris that he had just flown to Texas with. That was a weather balloon. And Colonel Ramey was the commanding officer of the 509th Bomb Squad, and he was, as I mentioned before, the one that dropped the atomic bomb. So they knew exactly what they were doing. So this story remained a legend until about 1978, when Stanton Friedman was giving a talk and a lecture at a college in Arkansas. And someone in the audience approached him and said, "Hey, would you like to talk to Jesse Marcel Sr.? He doesn't live far from here, and I've got his number. Would you like to speak with him?" And as a result of that meeting and that lecture that Stanton gave, and then he canceled his plans and didn't fly home, and he immediately went and drove and met Jesse Marcel Sr. Several books and movies and films have been researched about that, and that's why we know about that topic today. Edgar Mitchell, who was the seventh man to walk on the moon, grew up in Roswell, New Mexico. He was 11 years old at the time of the Roswell event. And he explained to a group of us, including Peter Robbins, who went to visit him at his home, that when he returned from the moon as an Apollo astronaut, NASA took him on tours of different cities, and one of them was Roswell. And when he was there, people from senior military staff who had been in charge of what was going on at the time approached him and said, "You should know this is real," and they had private conversations because most astronauts report very, very unusual things. Russian and Chinese astronauts are a little more open than American astronauts, but this is us loading Edgar's dishwasher, and this is us holding his command module. I was very lucky to actually be a friend of Edgar's. I met him when I was 19. I corresponded with him. I became a member of Noetic Sciences early on, and Edgar gave me a wonderful endorsement for the Travis Walton film, which I'm very proud of. So on July 19th, 1952, air traffic controllers at the Washington National Airport, now known as the Ronald Reagan Airport, spotted 7 aerial objects that were about 15 miles south of our Capitol, and they were moving rapidly towards the Capitol, and that is a no-fly zone. So these objects were identified by multiple radar air controllers. They were also seen by witnesses on the ground, and they were also photographed, and it made the cover of a local paper at that time. I believe it was the Washington Post. And jets were scrambled, and as soon as the jets flew over this area, these objects disappeared, and when the military jets left, they disappeared. So from 1947 to 1952, UFO events seem to be increasing. According to a very famous book, and I recommend anyone in the audience who wants to really know the UFO topic from the inception, read the classics. Go and read Donald Kehoe or read Edward Ruppelt, which many of the notes from my presentation are taken from Edward Ruppelt's book. But Edward Ruppelt was responsible for the early foundings of what we now know as Project Blue Book. And he was the head of the Army's internal research that went on the investigation of UFOs from the late 40s straight through to the early 50s. So in 1952, Harry Truman was very concerned about the massive buildup of UFO sightings that were blanketing national newspapers. There were over 16,000 articles that appeared on the cover of national newspapers in this country from 1947 straight through to 1952. And he wanted to do something about that to change the tide. He wanted to squelch the hysteria and the media frenzy that was building up. So he called together major departments to assess the situation. And these are the gentlemen that were called together: the Intelligence Advisory Board, the Central Intelligence Committee, the National Defense Committee, and the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They convened a joint research group to kind of figure out what to do about this frenzy. Basically, Truman wanted to know how to squelch the media, so he involved a man named Howard P. Robertson. Robertson was the director at that point of Weapons Systems Evaluations Group from 1950 to 52. He also served as a scientific advisor to NATO, and he was chosen to head this research project, which became known as the Robertson Panel. And basically, their goal was to assess the situation and then report back their recommendations to Congress, and this is famously known as the Robertson Panel, and they created the Robertson Report. Any of you, if you would like to read that Robertson Report, can. It's actually at this website, CUFON.org, and you can read it. But I'll briefly summarize. The Robertson Panel essentially decided that UFOs posed no direct threat to the U.S. military, nor to national security, but they did seem to pose a threat to overwhelming communication channels, causing panic. So they concluded that the media needed to be controlled. And this is quite clearly in their report. So you wonder where we get the agenda that's been afloat for the last 70 or 55, 60 years. This is exactly where it comes from. So they said that they needed to involve Hollywood and that they would try to come up with explanations so that anybody who saw unusual phenomenons, they would be told they had an untrained eye and they were not publicly able to identify what they saw. So they would involve scientists to come up with expert opinions or scientific opinions so that these events could be dealt with. They would also involve Hollywood to create silly films about Martians and little green men. They would create an era of ridicule and stigmatism. And that's been a very effective tool. You don't have to disprove a subject, you just have to make people uncomfortable to talk about it. And boom, suddenly anyone with credibility is debunked. And if you can't go after their facts, then you go after their reputation. And Stanton Friedman knew that well. Let me jump ahead here. So Edward Ruppelt, who was, a very decorated World War II veteran, he had served as a bomber pilot over Germany, and after the war, he was in charge of what was known as the Air Technical Intelligence Center at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was selected for this specifically because he had, besides being a great pilot and a decorated war hero, he had great writing skills, he had great communication skills, and he was hired to recruit Air Force research, top-notch brass to help him research the UFO phenomenon inside the military. This first project was known as Project Stein, and it was set up under a department called, I refer to it as ATIC. It's ATIC. It stood for the Air Technical Intelligence Command, and it was centered at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. He wrote a very critically acclaimed book, which I refer to many times in this presentation, and he talks about how the UFO secrecy was established inside the military probably around 1948. But on January 7th, 1948, a very well-known event happened. Kentucky Air National Guard pilot Thomas Mantell was ordered by his commander and the base commander to chase a UFO that 6 pilots all saw. There were several pilots up at the time, and a number of them saw it. Mantell decided he would chase it. But before he started to chase it, he described it. And he said he saw a massive craft. And he said that it was at about 20,000 feet. It was above him. And he couldn't get that high, of course, without oxygen, and he was flying without oxygen. But he wanted to chase this craft, so he probably went up too high into the atmosphere and probably passed out, and as a result of that, his craft crashed. But he described this as a massive disk that was moving rapidly up into the atmosphere and creating a hole in the clouds above it, and we still have these descriptions today. Edward Ruppelt, who was the head of the Air Technical Intelligence Command, what I had just mentioned, and assigned to research these things, he coined the phrase unidentified flying object, because at that point the flying saucer term was filled with too much ridicule, and he was speaking to major generals and people in the Army and the Air Force before it was considered the Air Force, and he knew that he had to come up with a term that they were going to hear and not think the ridicule topic. And now today we are at that same precipice, and now we say UAP instead of UFO. So his internal team was in charge. He had about 40 people at times working for him, gathering information and researching. And he would go and talk to very top military brass people. And these were generals and very high-ranking commanders. No one inside the military at this time, when he was in charge of Project Stein, nobody had any ridicule around the subject. They took it very seriously. He said in many cases you could hear a pin drop, and in many cases they called for emergency evaluations of events that were transforming, like when this captain's plane crashed. They decided they were going to come up with new ways to research and go after and study these UFOs. And in 1952, the Intelligence Committee inside the government described that they were going to adapt the Robertson Panel recommendations. Everything seemed to change within his his department. So first he was responsible for many different research committees that took place before it became Project Blue Book that we all knew. I'm sorry for the competition. I'll just give it a minute so it passes. The Robertson panel's recommendations were that a new committee was formed, and they called it Project Blue Book, and it would be a PR maneuvering campaign instead of any real research. So after 1952, according to Edward Ruppelt, that's when the Blue Book, became known as Project Blue Book that we all know, but they were no longer really doing anything. They were just coming up with scientific explanations like swamp gas and Venus as sightings to kind of quell the hysteria. And any real serious UFO research would continue, but strictly behind closed doors and strictly with a top secret group. And that's the point when most likely a Majestic 12 was formed. And Stanton Friedman did extensive research on this and believed that this committee really did exist. And James Forrestal was probably a part of that project. And that, according to Edward Ruppelt, from October of 1948, that's when the ridicule factor started to come in inside the military. Generals and things like that started to debunk the topic from 48 to 52. And most people don't really know that. I didn't know that. So at the same time, Project Blue Book became known as a public project, and we all knew that J. Allen Hynek had been assigned as the chairman of this project. What really happened behind the scenes is Edward Ruppelt, was taken off as the chair of all the internal research that was going on. He was also told that he was no longer allowed to speak with anyone who had a higher rank than him as captain. He was no longer allowed to speak with anyone with any authority on the topic of UFOs, and that the topic was no longer going to be taken seriously within the military. Now, J. Allen Hynek had actually been recruited by Edward Ruppelt to be part of his scientific advisory team, and he was. Allen Hynek served on several projects. The first one was called Stein in 1947. That changed to Project Twinkle in 1949, then to Project Grudge in 1949, and in 1952 it changed to Project Blue Book, which ran from 52 to 69. So Hynek was also a member of the Robertson panel, and he was a natural choice to head Project Blue Book because he was the head of astronomy at a major university, and he was considered to be credible. But very interestingly, towards the end of the time when Project Blue Book closed, which was in 1969, and it was closed by the government, they no longer wanted to take UFO reports, which I'll describe shortly. J. Allen Hynek himself founded his own organization called the Center for UFO Studies, or CUFOS, and he began to speak publicly on the subject that he now took seriously. He also supported NICAP, which is the National Investigation Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, and Hynek wrote his own book called Close Encounters, which revealed his conviction that UFOs were real. So Project Blue Book essentially created a real problem for the U.S. government, and this is probably why they did away with it. The Condon Report was established, this committee was put together by Edward Ruppelt, and it was designed to squelch the whole UFO topic. So just like the Robertson panel had been designed basically to, debunk any real research, the same was true of the Condon Report. In fact, the government said, or revealed by insiders, that the government realized that if they allowed the public to report UFOs, then that they were expected to report on these sightings. There was supposed to be, some kind of evaluation of their reporting, and they didn't want to provide assessments of the situation. So, Edward Ruppelt writes in his book, he believes that the government finally did away with Project Blue Book because that way they didn't have to report back to the public what they were seeing. And in 1969, when Project Blue Book closed, that's when the Mutual UFO Network was founded. And it was founded actually by a lot of ex-military people that were already very disgusted with what was going on in Project Blue Book. That's why I joined MUFON, because I was so impressed with the quality of the people that I met and the stories that they had to tell. So basically, the government didn't want to reveal what they were doing. They involved a professor named Edward Condon. He was from the University of Colorado. They hired him to put a research team together to research the UFO topic. And of course, comics like this abounded at the time, which is why I'm showing you. Usually the general public kind of knows what's going on. Condon, many years later, it was revealed that he had actually received a memo. This is often referred to as the trick memo, where Edward Condon himself actually stated that he already had a conclusion about the UFO topic and that he was just going to debunk the subject and not take it seriously. On November 27th, in 1978, J. Allen Hynek, by this time, who had become convinced that the phenomenon was real and posed, some sort of threat, he turned to the UN because his own nation really wouldn't take the subject seriously. And he presented at the United Nations. And most people don't know that this event took place, so that's why I'm mentioning it. So he believed that UFO research should be decentralized, not held by one particular government or one particular department, and that it should be sponsored by the UN, and it should be an international committee that studied the subject. He felt that the UFO problem was worldwide and needed worldwide cooperation in order to advance our understanding of this important phenomenon. So he invited Jacques Vallée, seen in this image, as one of the principal speakers. This was the only United Nations UFO presentation done in history where he urged serious international unbiased research to focus, attention on the subject. They were sponsored by the ambassador of Grenada. His name was Sir Eric Gary. And within a week of this event, the president of Grenada was deposed by a revolutionary coup, and the ambassador was replaced, and nothing more was heard about this committee. Peter Robbins was actually there at this event. Astronaut Gordon Cooper witnessed a craft in 1957 over the Edwards Air Force Base during a planned demonstration of some new aircraft, some military aircraft, like top secret aircraft was going to be on display, and he was there with a film crew to film it. And what happened is a disc-shaped UFO flew over the base. It apparently maneuvered a bit, then it put out 3 landing legs, and it descended to the opposite side of the air strip where this film crew was standing in a dry lake bed area. Gordon, along with the film crew, approached. They went to cross this airstrip so they could film this because they weren't quite sure this wasn't the advanced technology they were supposed to film. And as they got halfway across the airstrip, apparently what happened is this 30-foot disc, which had landed, suddenly took off, closed up its feet, and took off. This incident was spoken about by Gordon Cooper himself. It was actually confirmed later on Art Bell by a telephone repairman who said he was on a pole at the time and saw this outside right at the edge of the airbase himself. So, and of course, this footage was immediately taken out of the camera and sent to Washington, and Gordon Cooper himself never saw it. So there are many, many, many series of very top UFO events, which I encourage you all to research on your own. But they have been happening since 1941, well covered in the press, the very famous, battle over LA. And for those of you interested, I've made copies of these, what I call there are more than 10 here. There's probably about 20 UFO events, which I list for you. And I'm not going to go through them all, but you can see there's many of them here. I have 3 pages of them for you. And of course, it goes right up through to 2017. So I encourage you, if you want to research these, please come up and pick them up yourself. So, what is different today from all the years past? Stanton Friedman used to say, nobody seemed to send the memo or the trick memo to the UFOs themselves telling them that they don't exist because they just keep showing up. So what's different? What's happened? What makes us take this seriously today? It's very complicated, and there's not one single answer, but a whole complex culmination of events, I believe, in my research. Many classic debunkers have died off. New debunkers haven't gotten that sophisticated. There are new technological developments that have occurred. Our digital optics are just off the charts these days. Everyone in the audience has a very sophisticated video camera, and you can literally post live to the internet these days. And a significant people worldwide have access to the internet. So it makes hiding the UFO phenomenon almost impossible. And the citizen activist groups that have developed over the last 2 decades. One such event was recently reported by Captain Robert Salas. He hosted an event at the National Press Club to talk about his book that he wrote called Faded Giant, which recounted his experiences of a disc-shaped craft rendering a Minuteman missile, which he was responsible for guarding and possibly detonating. This happened in March 13th, 1967 at the Maelstrom Air Force Base. And so the UFO topic is the second most highly researched topic on the internet. I think you should know that. And I'm going to unpack just some of the technological advancements in camera equipment and military gun footage going forward. But first I'll note, even Ben Rich, who was the director of Lockheed Martin Skunk Works from 1975 to 1991, he spoke out about this. And he said, in a statement that he made to the University of Southern California Alumni Association, because he went there, he was an alum there, he said that we have aircraft that won't see the light of day for 30 to 50 years. He was demonstrating all the advanced aircraft that the Skunk Works had built. And at the close of his presentation, he showed this UFO on the screen, and he said, we have projects that are buried so top secret in such black projects that you won't see the light of them for 50 years. And then he ended his talk by saying, we have the technology to take E.T. home. Now, most of the audience laughed at that, but not everybody did. Some people realized what he was talking about. So we have just improvements in optics. You know, now we have the James Webb satellite, which if some of you are watching, the visuals we are getting back are huge. But before we got to the James Webb satellite and telescope, the Kepler satellite is what we relied on, and we made improvements to it several times with astronauts. So this would take pictures. The Kepler satellite revealed that there are about a quarter of all the stars in the Milky Way probably have habitable-sized Earth planets around them. And those Earth-sized planets probably have liquid water on their surface because it's the chemistry of life as we know it. And our optics are just getting more and more and more sophisticated. Also, the Hubble telescope now has had 2 major upgrades, and the ability of our optics has just improved exponentially. We can now estimate that the number of suns in our own Milky Way to be around 50 billion. That's B with a 50 billion. And the potential suns in our own galaxy, or stars in our own galaxy. And planets outnumber stars by 3 to 1. So the small Earth-like rocky planets that orbit the suns is much more common than, say, the gassy planets like Saturn or Jupiter. Of those 50 million suns that are in our own Milky Way galaxy, there are about 500 million potential Earth-like planets that could be in the Goldilocks zone, close enough to their suns to have water and potentially support life. And this means that there's a high likelihood that life could have evolved somewhere else as it has on our own planet. And this discovery was really only made in 2000. So let me just share with you, I think I got a little ahead of myself here, or behind myself. How many of you have actually ever looked and seen the Milky Way? It's astonishing when you can see it, when you can get far enough away from a light-polluted area and just gaze into the sky. Well, this gentleman named Bill Williams, he worked at the Space Telescope Science Institute, and he wanted to focus the time of the Hubble telescope into one of the darkest regions of space because he thought this really needed to be done. He wanted to harness those hours, upwards of 100 hours, possibly 4 days or more, and no one astronomer really gets access to the Hubble telescope for that amount of time. They get 3 hours, 4 hours, and it rotates around the globe with major, astronomical centers. And all of his colleagues ridiculed him and said, why do you want to take the Hubble, focus it in the darkest region of space where we know nothing exists and we can't see anything and we have no light coming in? Why would you want to waste 100 hours of telescope time? And he said, no, I'd really like to do this. And he tried to get his colleagues to donate their time and then share with him in the pickings because he believed that light would fill the telescope. But few supported him. He was ridiculed, but he saved up over like a couple of years his telescope time. And finally, what was revealed was the fact that from the darkest regions of space, we suddenly saw thousands of pieces of light coming into the telescope, right? Are you here to tell me we're out of time, Peter, because I started 10 minutes late?
A couple minutes.
Okay, well, I will do my best. I'll try to jump ahead, and I'll just try to paraphrase some of this. So this, in 2000, changed the nature of our understanding, right, by a huge amount. The other thing that really happened recently, if maybe you missed it, maybe you didn't, was October 19th. This major asteroid appears, right, in our solar system, and we're able to see it with our Pan-SEERS telescope in Hawaii and some of our other telescopes, too. So the object came into our solar system between Venus and the sun, and it came in at a very high rate of speed. Then all of a sudden it slows down, it almost stops, it changes directions, makes a 90-degree turn, and it takes off at a very high rate of speed. And that was like called a Muamua. We didn't know what it was, right? Well, this very famous astronomer actually made headlines when he wrote numerous articles that started around December 19th, 2018, that we may have had our first interloper or our first interstellar visitor. He believed that and he openly said, regular comets have outgassing. This had none. And it was most likely, possibly, some kind of craft from an advanced civilization. I'm going to jump over the citizen hearings because most of you know what they are, but I just wanted to point out that the citizens hearings run by Steve Bassett in 2013, which Peter Robbins actually was a guest speaker at as well, was probably a much better hearing than the current hearings that just happened this past May. And I would encourage you to watch them if you'd like to know a little bit more about what can be revealed in, say, more elaborate citizens hearings. I would also encourage you to follow the work of Robert Bigelow because he openly stated on national television when he was interviewed by Laura Logan, he absolutely said to her, I believe that we are not alone and that we are being visited. And of course, Robert Bigelow is the head of Bigelow Aerospace, a very reputable and involved in skunk works and things like that. He's really quite an important person to listen to. And of course, many of you know about Luis Elizondo coming forward. What some of you may or may not know is that basically Senator Harry Reid was the one that got funding for Elizondo when he was in a project that was first called the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Application Program. If you wanted the government to give funding towards a project, you put it under a weapons application and they're going to fund it. But OSWAP was the first program before what we now know as the ATIP program. And he was in charge of this and finally resigned from his post because he felt that the government didn't really take it seriously. And of course, we were very lucky to see Ralph Blumenthal yesterday, but because of this article that both Ralph Blumenthal, Leslie Keene, and Helene Cooper wrote in the New York Times, which took several months to put together, probably close to 6 months, and it was a well-orchestrated event with the cooperation of Harry Reid and people inside the Pentagon that allowed this information to come forward. Now we are living, I believe, in a post-disclosure world. And of course, many of you have watched the Tic Tac videos. You can certainly talk about them at the Thanksgiving table because they've been all over the news. And of course, so was Luis Elizondo and Harry Reid. So I encourage you to share that information with your family. This is just an interesting note that Penn State University has announced that they have a $110 million funding project now out to study UFOs, to actually create a college to study UFOs. Like we have colleges of medicine and college of metallurgies, there is now going to be a UAP college. And I would encourage you to follow what Penn State is doing, because when a major academic institution is addressing this topic seriously, other people tend to take it seriously. And I'll also note, I thought this was funny, nobody else really seemed to pay much attention to this, but you know, the story of the UAPs broke in December of 2017, but the Navy didn't give the pilots, even though they released their footage, the Navy never gave the pilots permission to speak about this. So you didn't start to hear David Fravor talk on major network news until May of 2019, when the Navy finally gave pilots permission to speak about what they had filmed, even though their footage was out there and their voices were out there. And of course, I would encourage you to research Kevin Day and learn about the radar that was used to detect these UFOs. It was a flotilla of UFOs. It wasn't one or two like you see in the news footage. There was a flotilla of craft that showed up over 5 naval ships that were all in a network array of new radar that was orchestrated by an aircraft that flew over these 5 ships and linked their radar together. So each of the ships could see upwards of 100 miles instead of 20 miles on either side of them with radar. And he talks about these craft that flew up 80,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 2,000 feet, water level, back up instantaneously. Kevin Day is a real hero, in my opinion, that he's come forward. Another interesting thing, this is a female astronaut from the UK who absolutely confirmed that we are not alone in the universe. She believes that there are many life forms and they are here interacting with us. And the former head of the Israeli Space Force also came out with some amazing statements that we are not alone in the universe, that there is a galactic federation, that we've been in touch with them, we have treaties with them, and those federations do not believe we are ready for disclosure. And my final slide just here to say that the dismal events that we just had take place in the public hearings on the UFO topic in our Congress were, in my opinion, not really significant, but they are, in spite of the fact that nothing was really revealed and they're going to only talk about significant events behind closed doors. We need to accept the fact that this was the first official congressional hearing on the UFO topic in 50 years, and we have to appreciate it. So thank you for your time, and I'll be available for questions later.